For weeks, every headline seemed glued to the same story: airstrikes in Venezuela, Maduro's arrest, debates over oil reserves, and endless arguments about whether it was an invasion or just law enforcement. But that phase is now behind us. What's unfolding today is far bigger than one chaotic Saturday in Caracas. Venezuela has stopped being the story. It's now the test case, a test of how the United States wields power, how China projects influence without force, and how Latin America observes both with growing judgment. And here's the part most analysts are missing entirely. The way the US acted handed China a huge propaganda win. While Beijing talks about peace and dialogue, Washington responded with bombs and threats. And that contrast is being noticed across the region. This wasn't just a crisis. It was a global test run, and the world just graded it. Today, I want to break down what's actually shifting, not just the facts on the ground in Venezuela, but the deeper ways this operation is reshaping perceptions across Latin America, empowering China's diplomatic narrative, and exposing a real transformation in how American power is viewed abroad. This story isn't just about headlines anymore. It's about how power works in the world today. What we're witnessing isn't just a shock event. It's a shift in how influence is exercised when coercion replaces persuasion. Let me walk you through what's really happening and what actually changed this week. First, the narrative moved from isolated events to structural consequences. What began as strikes and an arrest has now entered the machinery of U.S. law. Former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has been arraigned in a federal courtroom in New York on narcotics and related charges that were unsealed after his capture, pulling the situation into the U.S. judicial system and its legal processes. But the global reaction is what altered the landscape. This isn't just a few scattered condemnations anymore. It's coordinated regional pushback. Powerful voices from across Latin America and beyond have openly criticized the operation as a violation of international norms. They argue that capturing a sitting head of state without consent breaches foundational aspects of the UN Charter and sets a dangerous precedent. That's a massive shift. The question has moved from, is this legal under U.S. law, to, does international law matter when a major power decides to ignore it? And that question has implications far beyond Venezuela. Here's how American power is being reshaped structurally. For decades, U.S. influence was built on alliances, institutions, economic integration, and shared rules. Nations aligned with the U.S. because it offered stability, markets, and predictable partnerships. But that foundation is eroding. What's replacing it is economic coercion backed by the threat of force. Today, the United States increasingly leans on sanctions, court actions, asset freezes, control over financial networks, and strategic energy leverage to bend others to its will. According to recent analysis, more than 60% of low-income countries are under some form of U.S. sanctions, and the United States poses 3 times more sanctions than any other country or international organization. This isn't alliance building, it's pressure application. If states don't comply with U.S. policy demands, they can be cut off from dollar-based financial systems. Try to work around those systems, and you face secondary sanctions that punish anyone who does business with you. And now, as the Venezuela episode shows, when economic coercion doesn't produce the desired outcome, military action becomes the fallback. That's a dramatic departure from how American influence once operated. But here's the problem. To much of the world, this doesn't look like leadership. It looks like coercion. It looks like threats instead of partnerships. And that changes how other countries calculate their interests. Because if partnering with the United States means you might become the next target when policies change, why tie your economy to U.S. poor controlled systems? This is the strategic contradiction at the heart of today's power dynamics. The more the U.S. relies on economic pressure and force to maintain dominance, the more incentive other nations have to reduce their dependence on systems controlled by Washington. And here's where China's role really matters, not with troops or threats, but with positioning and narrative. China scored a massive optics victory without firing a single shot. Beijing publicly condemned the U.S. military operation, calling it a violation of international law and Venezuela's sovereignty, and urged restraint and respect for the United Nations Charter. Beijing's message wasn't just diplomatic language, it was a strategic signal, and it landed hard across Latin America. China cast itself as a defender of state sovereignty and peaceful resolution, positioning Washington as the aggressor. While many nations in the region already have extensive Chinese infrastructure, investment, and loans, the U.S. response, bombs and force, stood in stark contrast to China's calls for dialogue and de-escalation. This isn't about China being a moral authority. Beijing has its own record of coercion. But in this moment, in this region, China looks like the more stable partner, while the United States looks unpredictable and heavy-handed. Across Latin America, leaders openly criticized Washington's actions. Brazil's president said the operation crossed an unacceptable line and violated international law. Mexico strongly condemned the strikes and framed them as a threat to regional stability. That's significant. These are major regional powers, not just disagreeing with the U.S., but questioning its reliability as a partner. Instead of deterring China's influence, the U.S. intervention has inadvertently advertised it. Latin American countries are watching and asking, if the U.S. can do this to Venezuela, what stops them from doing it to us? And this matters because the Venezuela operation didn't happen in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern of U.S. pressure across the hemisphere. In recent months, the Trump administration publicly pressured Colombia on migration policy, Mexico on border and trade issues, Cuba as it always has, and even signaled concerns about Panama and the canal. Venezuela now looks like proof that such pressure can escalate from political coercion to military force. So Latin American governments are recalculating long-held assumptions. For decades, aligning with the United States was seen as a path to economic benefits and security guarantees. That assumption is now in question. Countries are choosing between two very different models. China's approach, predictable economic engagement, infrastructure, loans, trade deals with long-term contracts, and fewer political conditions. The United States' access to the world's largest economy, but with demands on foreign policy alignment, trade rules, and now the risk of sudden military escalation that appears tied to domestic political shifts. For many nations, especially those that have felt the weight of U.S. pressure, China's model is starting to look more stable and less risky than an America that can pivot suddenly based on internal politics or strategic gambits. It's not that China is morally superior. It's that it's predictable. And that shift from seeing the U.S. as the natural partner to seeing China as a viable alternative is a strategic loss for Washington that could take years, even decades, to reverse. Now let's bring this back to oil, because oil is still at the heart of why Venezuela matters. Venezuela sits on 300 billion barrels of proven reserves, the largest in the world. But under Maduro, production collapsed, infrastructure decayed, output fell from over 3 million barrels per day to less than 1 million. So why is this strategically important if Venezuela isn't producing much? It's not about today's barrels. It's about future control and the currency in which oil is traded. For 50 years, global oil has been priced in U.S. dollars. That system creates automatic demand for the dollar, allowing the United States to borrow cheaply and finance deficits that would otherwise be unsustainable. But that system is cracking. BRICS nations are increasingly settling energy trades in local currencies. Saudi Arabia refused to renew its exclusive dollar deal, and Venezuela under Maduro was selling oil to China in yuan, settled through Chinese payment systems. If Venezuela proves that oil can be sold outside the dollar system and survive, other countries may follow. That's the real threat. The U.S. removed Maduro's government to bring Venezuelan oil back into dollar-denominated trade, prevent China from gaining independent access, and maintain global pricing control. But here's the irony. China builds infrastructure in Venezuela, the U.S. bombs it. China offers stability, the U.S. creates crisis. For oil-producing nations watching, the lesson is clear: selling to China might be safer than selling to the U.S., because China won't invade if you change suppliers. This is the strategic contradiction. Short-term control over Venezuelan oil may be secured, but in the long term, it accelerates the shift toward non-dollar energy systems. Now let's talk about international law and the UN. The credibility collapse. Under the UN Charter, using military force against another state without Security Council authorization or an imminent threat is prohibited. That principle exists to prevent great powers from invading weaker neighbors. The U.S. violated it, and when confronted, the response was essentially, so what? Multiple countries noted the obvious hypocrisy. This looks exactly like the unilateral aggression the U.S. condemns when Russia or China does it. If rules only apply when convenient, they aren't rules, they're preferences. And preferences enforced by power. That's coercion. This isn't new. The U.S. supported a coup attempt against Hugo Chavez in 2002 and has been trying to influence regime change in Venezuela for over 20 years through sanctions, political pressure, and opposition support. But this operation was different. Direct military action, airstrikes on a capital city, the removal of a sitting head of state by force. That sets a dangerous precedent. If the U.S. can act like this without consequences, what stops other powers from doing the same? Why should China respect Taiwan's sovereignty? Why should Russia respect Ukraine's borders? International law was supposed to constrain such actions. But if it doesn't constrain the United States, why should it constrain anyone? This is the credibility collapse. And it's not just a legal problem, it's an institutional crisis. The United Nations system depends on great powers at least pretending to respect the rules. When a powerful country openly disregards those rules, the system loses legitimacy. And once legitimacy is gone, all that's left is raw power, and power alone is a brittle foundation for a stable global order. Here's a dimension that rarely gets discussed. These decisions often don't reflect the will of the American people. They reflect the momentum of institutions that benefit from conflict and instability. President Eisenhower warned about this very reality back in 1961 when he talked about the military-industrial complex, the idea that defense industries and the security establishment could come to drive policy across the government and society. That warning is more relevant now than ever. Today, U.S. foreign policy is increasingly shaped not by democratic debate or voter preferences, but by a security establishment with massive budgets, minimal oversight, and built-in incentives to favor action over restraint. In the Venezuela operation, Congress wasn't consulted before the strikes, and legislators who are typically briefed on sensitive operations were informed only after the military action had already begun. Powers granted to the executive branch through emergency authorities have expanded presidential control so much that military interventions can happen without meaningful checks from the legislature. This isn't about one administration. It's about a structural shift in how U.S. foreign policy is carried out, one where the executive branch, backed by intelligence agencies and defense contractors, can conduct operations that reshape global relations without democratic accountability. The cost of this shift shows up in ways that aren't always visible: strained alliances, countries hedging against American unpredictability, and an erosion of U.S. soft power and diplomatic credibility. This isn't necessarily what the American people want. It's the momentum of the machine. Now, let's bring this back to what it means for Americans, especially those nearing or in retirement. One clear connection is energy prices. If the Venezuela situation stabilizes and production increases over time, that could help lower gasoline and diesel costs. But if the situation fragments and instability spreads, prices could spike. Another connection is dollar stability. The strength of the U.S. dollar depends partly on its continued dominance in global trade, especially in energy markets. If countries accelerate their shift away from dollar-based systems, something Venezuela's new pricing arrangements are already encouraging, that reduces global demand for U.S. currency. Lower demand can weaken the dollar's purchasing power. That affects everything priced in dollars, which is most of what Americans buy. For retirees, this matters for bond portfolios and retirement funds. If the dollar weakens and global appetite for U.S. Treasury bonds drops, American borrowing costs could rise and bond values could fall. And that directly impacts retirement accounts, pension funds, and even the long-term sustainability of Social Security. And beneath all of this is a moral dimension, a deeper question about whether power should be used to force outcomes, or whether international cooperation and respect for rules matter in shaping a more secure and stable world. Many Americans over 65 grew up believing the United States stood for stability, law, and global order. Watching that credibility erode, seeing the U.S. act in ways that resemble the behavior it historically condemned, is unsettling in ways that go beyond economics. The world's view of America shapes how Americans see themselves. And right now, that perception is shifting in ways that should concern anyone who cares about the country's moral standing. So here's the big strategic question that should dominate analysis, but almost never does. Has the United States entered a phase where coercion replaces persuasion, threats replace alliances, and raw power replaces legitimacy? Because that's what the Venezuela operation suggests. When economic pressure doesn't work, military force is deployed. When allies hesitate, they're rebuked. When international law conflicts with strategic goals, it's brushed aside. Meanwhile, China is winning influence without firing a shot, without threatening war, and without destabilizing regions. China funds infrastructure, offers long-term loans and trade agreements, and doesn't lecture countries about how they must govern internally. That's not moral superiority. China has its own record of repression and coercion. But in the contest for influence among developing nations, China's approach is proving more effective than American pressure tactics. In many capitals across Latin America, Africa, and Asia, officials see the United States as unpredictable and aggressive, while China appears stable and pragmatic. That's a strategic loss. Countries are asking themselves, who is a reliable partner, and who might turn on you when politics shift? So where does this leave us? History will not remember Venezuela for Maduro's trial or the legal debates in New York. It will be remembered as the moment the United States lost the moral high ground, the moment China gained diplomatic ground, the moment Latin America questioned American restraint. The U.S. military action may have achieved its immediate objective. Maduro is in custody and legal proceedings are underway, but the strategic cost is enormous. Alliances are strained. International institutions are weakened. The very rules-based order the United States claims to defend has been undermined by American actions that many nations view as a breach of international law. Countries around the world are drawing conclusions that will shape the next decade of global politics. Aligning too closely with the United States is risky. Diversifying away from dollar-based systems and U.S. influence is prudent. China's offer of economic partnership without overt political strings is worth considering. The real question is not whether the Venezuela operation was legal under U.S. law. That debate is mostly domestic. The question is whether this is how America plans to lead through economic pressure backed by military force, through coercion rather than cooperation. Because if that's the strategy, the world will respond by building alternatives, new financial systems, new trade blocs, and new security partnerships that seek stability over threats. History will forget the specific operation, but it will remember the shift, a shift that is redefining what American power means in the 21st century.